What I actually said to Denzel was,
A note before we start. Hated makes for a great thumbnail, but the real, on-record stories behind these 6 moments are more interesting than outright hatred. They're stories about a man who takes his job so seriously that other actors sometimes mistook his discipline for dislike, and a couple of times it really did boil over into anger. Every story below comes from interviews the actors themselves gave, on podcasts, at festivals, or to major outlets. Here's what actually happened. Denzel Washington has spent more than 4 decades building a reputation as the most disciplined man in Hollywood. 2 Oscars, 9 nominations, and a career built on total immersion in every role he plays. He came up through the New York theater world before Hollywood ever took notice, and that stage background never really left him. On a movie set, he treats a script the way a surgeon treats a chart, and he expects everyone around him to treat it with the same seriousness. That is a philosophy that has produced some of the most memorable performances of the last 50 years. It has also produced friction. When an actor treats a film set like a battlefield of preparation, the people standing across from him don't always know whether they're looking at Denzel or the character he has become. A director's note that feels routine to one person can feel like a personal insult to Washington if it threatens the integrity of a scene. A joke meant to break tension can land, in his world, as a lack of seriousness about the work. Over the decades, this has led to a string of very real, very well-documented moments of friction with people who shared the screen with him, moments that these actors themselves have chosen to talk about publicly on podcasts, at festivals, and in television interviews. Today, we're counting down 6 of those moments, starting with the smallest spark and building to the coldest set on this entire list, and looking at what actually happened once the cameras stopped rolling. Ryan Reynolds is not exactly known for being intimidated by anyone. The man built an entire career on being the fastest-talking, most self-aware guy in the room. But even Reynolds admits that in 2012, on the set of the action thriller Safe House, he managed to get on Denzel Washington's bad side in the worst possible way, during the most important scene in the entire movie. The 2 actors were shooting the film's climactic ending. Washington's character, a rogue former CIA operative named Tobin Frost, was dying on screen. It was a heavy, emotionally loaded scene, the kind that requires total silence and total focus from everyone on set. Washington had spent the whole shoot building toward that final quiet moment, and then, in the middle of the take, a phone started ringing. According to Reynolds, speaking years later at the Toronto Film Festival while promoting an unrelated documentary, the phone was his. Washington did not wait for the director to call cut. He reportedly turned and shouted, "Who the FS phone is that?" right in the middle of shooting his own character's death scene. Reynolds described the moment as inexcusable, admitting it was entirely his fault and that he fully understood why Washington was furious. Interrupting an actor mid-take on any set is bad form. Interrupting Denzel Washington mid-take, during a death scene he had been building toward for weeks of shooting, was something else entirely. What makes this story worth remembering is not just the anger, it is what it reveals about how Washington works. He does not treat any scene as disposable, even in a big, commercial action movie built around chase sequences and gunfights. A ringing phone was not just a technical mistake to him, it was a break in a reality he had spent the entire day constructing, piece by piece, take after take. For an actor who prepares as meticulously as Washington does, the final moments of a film are often the ones he has been building toward the longest, and having that moment punctured by something as mundane as a ringtone would understandably feel like a small betrayal of the process. Reynolds, to his credit, has never tried to spin the story in his own favor. Every time he has told it, whether at a festival panel or in a later interview, he leads with his own embarrassment rather than any complaint about Washington's reaction. He has described it as a completely fair response to an inexcusable mistake, and has used the story more as a lesson about set etiquette than as evidence of Washington being difficult to work with. Reynolds walked away from that day, having learned a very specific lesson about respecting another actor's process, and he has told the story since with more embarrassment than resentment. There is no indication that the 2 ever worked together again after Safe House, though nothing suggests it was a lasting grudge, so much as one very bad afternoon that neither man forgot. If there is one story that best captures how far Denzel Washington will go to protect a character, It is what happened between him and Josh Brolin on the set of American Gangster in 2007. Brolin played a corrupt detective squaring off against Washington's Frank Lucas, a real-life Harlem heroin kingpin. Washington had spent months preparing to embody Lucas, using the kind of deep, immersive character work he has relied on throughout his career. Brolin later explained, in an interview promoting his own memoir, that Washington showed up a little late to set on the day of their big scene together and quietly rearranged the structure of his own lines without much explanation. Brolin, trying to stay confident across from a two-time Oscar winner, was struggling to remember his own dialogue. In a moment of nerves, he forgot a line and instinctively reached out and put his hand on Washington's shoulder to ask for it. Washington knocked his hand away instantly. "Don't ever put your hand on me," he reportedly said, without breaking character. Brolin recalled being stunned, thinking for a split second that the two of them were about to physically fight right there on set. It was only afterward that Brolin realized what had actually happened. Washington was not speaking as himself. He was fully inside Frank Lucas, a man who would never tolerate being touched without permission, and the physical contact had triggered a reaction from the character rather than the actor. There is an added layer of pressure to Brolin's version of the story that is easy to miss. At the time of filming, Brolin was not yet the established star audiences know from later blockbusters. He has said openly that being cast opposite Washington in a major Ridley Scott production felt like an audition in itself, a chance for the industry to see whether he could hold his own next to one of the biggest actors alive. Forgetting a line in that moment was not just a small technical slip for him. It carried the weight of feeling like he was failing a test in front of people who were deciding whether he belonged. Brolin has been careful every time he tells this story to note that the two of them get along extremely well today, and that in hindsight, the entire moment taught him something valuable about total commitment to a role. He has framed it less as a story about being frightened and more as a story about watching, up close, what full immersion actually looks like when a scene is running hot. It is one of the more famous examples in Hollywood of method acting spilling over into real, unscripted tension, and it remains one of the clearest windows into just how completely Washington disappears into the people he plays, sometimes to the point that the line between character and actor becomes genuinely hard to see from the outside. Not every clash on this list came from something that happened between takes. Some of the tension around Denzel Washington has come from what happens when the culture pushes back on the choices he makes as an actor, and his co-stars end up standing right next to him in the crossfire. On Training Day in 2001, Washington played Alonzo Harris, a corrupt, morally bankrupt LAPD detective, opposite Ethan Hawke's rookie cop. The role eventually won Washington his second Oscar, but making it was not without controversy. Hawke has recalled that during production, representatives from the NAACP visited the set to raise concerns about a black actor of Washington's stature playing such a villainous character. According to Hawke, Washington did not flinch. His response, as Hawke remembers it, was simple and pointed. If Al Pacino is allowed to play morally complicated, even villainous characters without his entire career being questioned, why should the standard be any different for him? It was not a shouting match between Washington and Hawke themselves, but Hawke has described the atmosphere around the film as tense in a way that put real pressure on everyone attached to the project, including the actor standing across from Washington in nearly every scene. What this story shows is a different kind of conflict than the others on this list. It was not personal friction with a co-star so much as Washington drawing a hard line about his own artistic freedom, with Hawke close enough to feel the heat of that fight throughout the shoot. Hawke has recalled that the pressure of that outside scrutiny bled into the atmosphere on set in ways that made an already dark, difficult film feel even heavier. Playing a rookie cop being slowly corrupted by Alonzo Harris meant that Hawke spent most of the production locked into scenes with a character and an actor operating at a level of intensity he has described as unlike almost anything else in his career. Taken together, the picture that emerges is not one of Washington turning on a co-star, but of a set where the stakes, both artistic and cultural, were unusually high, and where Hawke found himself standing directly in the middle of that pressure for months at a time. Hawke has spoken about the experience with clear respect, framing it as one of the more intense, formative sets of his career rather than a personal falling out. By 2016, Ellen Pompeo had spent over a decade playing Meredith Grey, the lead character on Grey's Anatomy, and had more say over that set than almost anyone in television. That same year, Denzel Washington agreed to direct a single episode of the show, titled The Sound of Silence, as a favor to his longtime friend and the show's executive producer, Debbie Allen. The episode centered on a brutal, emotionally difficult storyline in which Meredith is attacked by a patient. During rehearsals for a key confrontation scene, Pompeo, drawing on years of instinct for her own character, improvised a line, telling the actor playing the patient to look at her while he apologized. To Pompeo, it was a natural creative choice from an actress who knew her character better than anyone alive. To Washington, stepping into the director's chair, it was a departure from the script he had prepared without his approval. Pompeo has since spoken about the moment publicly, describing how Washington immediately stepped in and made clear that as the director, he was the one who determined what happened in the scene. The disagreement escalated in front of the crew, with Pompeo pointing out that this was her show and she had been playing this character for years. It became, by her own account, one of the more intense professional confrontations of her career, a genuine clash between two people who were both used to having the final word on set. There is a structural reason this particular clash was almost inevitable. Television, especially a long-running show like Grey's Anatomy, runs on a different power structure than film. A star who has led a series for a decade often has more creative authority over her character than any visiting director could realistically expect to have, especially a director parachuting in for a single episode. Washington, coming from a film world where the director's word is close to final, was operating under a completely different assumption about who had the last say. Pompeo, coming from years of building Meredith Grey from the ground up, was operating under the opposite one. Neither of them was wrong about how their own world worked. They simply collided at the point where those two worlds overlapped. What makes the story land the way it does is that both of them have spoken about it since with a mix of respect and honesty rather than bitterness. Pompeo has called it one of the wildest days of her career, while also crediting Washington's direction for the strength of that episode, which went on to be widely praised for its handling of a difficult, sensitive storyline. Washington, for his part, has not returned to direct another television episode since, and has spoken more broadly about finding the structure of TV sets different from what he is used to in film, where the hierarchy of decision-making is drawn much more clearly before anyone ever steps on set. Long before he was one of the most celebrated directors in the world, Quentin Tarantino was best known in the mid-1990s as a script doctor, brought in to punch up dialogue on other people's movies. In 1995, he was hired to do exactly that on Crimson Tide, the submarine thriller starring Denzel Washington and Gene Hackman. Somewhere in Tarantino's rewrites, Washington found dialogue he considered racially charged and completely inappropriate for the film. Rather than raise the issue quietly through a producer or an agent, Washington confronted Tarantino directly, reportedly right there during production. It was a direct, public clash between a major star and a rapidly rising creative force, and according to later reporting, it created a rift between the two men that lasted for years. It is worth pointing out how unusual this confrontation actually was for the time. In 1995, Tarantino was already the most talked-about young filmmaker in the industry off the success of Pulp Fiction, and studios were paying him significant money just to punch up dialogue on other people's scripts. Most actors in Washington's position, established stars working with a screenwriter riding that kind of momentum, would have raised concerns quietly through a producer rather than confronting him directly on set in front of a full cast and crew. That Washington chose to handle it himself, in the moment, says as much about his approach to conflict as it does about the specific dialogue that upset him. For nearly a decade, by most accounts, there was no public reconciliation between them, no joint interview, no acknowledgement that anything had happened. It was one of those quiet, industry-known feuds that everyone in Hollywood seemed to be aware of, but nobody discussed on the record. The thaw eventually came through an unlikely connection. Washington's daughter, Katia, ended up working as a production assistant on Tarantino's film Django Unchained, which brought the two men back into each other's orbit years later. They eventually spoke, cleared the air, and by 2012, Washington was telling interviewers that he genuinely liked what Tarantino had done with that film, closing the book on one of the longest quiet standoffs of his career. It stands as a reminder that in an industry built on repeat collaborations, a single line of dialogue can carry consequences that last for the better part of a decade. If there is one actor whose entire public persona seemed built to clash with Denzel Washington's philosophy of acting, it is Jared Leto. Leto has built a reputation around extreme, immersive method acting, famously staying in character for months and, during Suicide Squad, reportedly sending co-stars unsettling in-character gifts to unnerve them. When the two were paired together in the 2021 thriller The Little Things, with Washington playing a burned-out detective and Leto playing the prime suspect, industry watchers were curious to see what would happen when Leto's antics met Washington's much quieter, more internal process. Washington has said publicly that Leto did not attempt any of his usual off-camera games during filming, a comment that read as both an observation and a subtle statement about who was really setting the tone on that set. What makes this story unusual is that Washington did not simply resist Leto's approach. He reportedly met it with his own, just in a much quieter register. Because their characters were adversaries in the film, a burned-out cop and the man he suspects of murder, Washington leaned into that antagonism off-camera as well. Reporting at the time of the film's release described him going as far as staking out near Leto's apartment to help maintain the frosty distance between them that the story required, an approach that is almost the mirror image of Leto's own past habit of sending unsettling gifts to unsettle his scene partners. Two actors, two completely different philosophies of immersion, arriving at a similar destination from opposite directions. It was not friendship, and by most accounts the two actors did not spend much time together during the production or its brief promotional run, but it also was not simple animosity. It was two very different approaches to the same craft, each one committed completely to keeping the tension in the film as real as possible. Where Leto's method has often been described as theatrical and outward-facing, built around startling the people around him, Washington's version was colder and more internal, closer to a quiet standoff than a performance for an audience of crew members. The final product carries that chill on screen, a testament to just how far both actors were willing to go to make an uneasy relationship between two characters feel genuinely uneasy, even if it meant an unusually distant working relationship between the two men themselves. Looking at these 6 stories side by side, a clearer picture starts to form. Denzel Washington has never been the actor who explodes without reason or holds a grudge for the sake of it. What connects Ryan Reynolds' ringing phone, Josh Brolin's hand on his shoulder, Ethan Hawke's controversial role, Ellen Pompeo's improvised line, Quentin Tarantino's rewritten dialogue, and Jared Leto's method games is a single, consistent standard: respect for the work itself. Break that focus, and Washington will let you know immediately, in the moment, without hesitation. Meet that standard, and by nearly every account on this list, he becomes one of the most respected, generous collaborators in the business. None of these 6 actors walked away from their experience describing Denzel Washington as an enemy. What they describe, almost without exception, is a man who takes the work more seriously than almost anyone else in the room, and who expects everyone standing across from him to rise to that same level. It is a lesson every one of them has carried into the rest of their careers. Whether it is Reynolds being more careful about a ringing phone, Brolin learning to read the difference between an actor and a character, or Pompeo walking away with a clearer sense of how much authority a visiting director really has on someone else's set. What is easy to miss in the retelling of stories like these is how rare it actually is for working actors to speak this candidly about tension with a colleague at all. Hollywood runs on relationships, and burning a bridge with someone as respected as Denzel Washington is not a risk most actors take lightly. The fact that Reynolds, Brolin, Hawke, Pompeo, and even Leto's collaborators have been willing to describe these moments in such specific detail says something about how memorable working across from Washington actually is. It leaves a mark, one way or another, and years later, it is still one of the stories these actors reach for first when asked about the most intense day of their career. Which of these moments surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments, and we will see you in the next video.